She walks through the halls of my high school. Her hair is a halo of gold. She runs through my dreams as I slumber, my sanity threatening to fold. I rubbed the bridge of my nose and took another sip of coffee. It was strong, black, and warm from sitting untouched for so long. I looked back at what I had written, 12 verses written over 5 years, and each more troubling than the last. This poem would likely be my unfinished work, a labor of love that would remain my final mystery. But the poem's subject is herself a mystery to me. Lisa, the darling girl of my dreams, who steals a little more of my soul every night, has been with me for 5 long years. Lisa, the girl who no longer exists. I stroll through the halls of academia. I move through the silence that creeps. She glides like a goddess of reason, this angel who comes when I sleep. I wrote those words on January 25th, 2014. I was a sophomore in high school, still struggling to mold my burgeoning talent while dealing with the growing flames of my teenage hormones. For years, I'd been told that I wrote well, English teachers and creative writing teachers praising my work, but they always said that it lacked a focus that they hoped I would find in time. Your ideas are scattered, your thoughts uncoordinated, and for someone with your raw talent, these are threads that we hope you will find. That's what my 9th grade English teacher wrote on my final assignment, a short story about the ideas of servitude but not slavery, right under the lurid red A she'd written on the paper. Miss Harper had often told me that I had talent, and told me that she expected me to focus that talent if I ever thought to make something of myself in the writer trade. On that day, as I sat at the picnic table outside the cafeteria and wrote ideas in my notebook, I found some of those threads she was talking about. I had slept deeply the night before, and dreamed vividly as I did sometimes. In the dreams, I was walking through the halls of Chester C. Smith High School, and on that day, I walked alone. There was none of the usual tropey at school in your underwear sort of thing, but the school did have a slightly lucid feel to it. I felt like I was underwater sometimes, everything having a slightly wavy feeling to it. As I walked, I began to become more and more sure that something was watching me. There was no one there. The silence in the school was almost oppressive, but at the edge of my vision, I could just make out the form of a girl following me. She slid silently along the walls, glided noiselessly through the world. Several times as I whipped around suddenly, I could see her hiding from me. Those few glimpses were enough to tell me 2 things. She was human, and she was lovely. She stalks through my dreams like a shadow, a hunting cat ready to pounce. Her mind is a mystery to me. Her very secrecy, humanity renounced. I had the dream again a week later. It was much the same, walking through the silent halls of high school, the terrain wavering like aquarium weeds as this ghostly girl stalked me. I did not indicate that I was aware of her, not turning to speak or looking for her, but just studying her out of the corner of my eye. She was blonde, corn silk hair spilling down her back in a sheet, and her clothes were a pair of jeans and a simple white shirt with no particular design. She seemed to be about my age, but could have been older, I suppose. There was a way about her that made me think she was older than I in my mind. Like when you meet someone who's had to grow up very quickly and been forced to cast their childhood aside before they were comfortable. She followed me silently until I woke up, and when I sat up, I grabbed for my notepad on the nightstand and wrote those 4 lines. I wouldn't revisit her for another 3 months. Her secrecy seems to be prudent, for her shelter is not solely her own. I have seen what lurks in the shadows, and it threatens to evict her from home. Writing about the Dream Girl was what I had named her after the 2nd verse, had lit a fire in me, it seemed. Suddenly, I wrote pieces for every school contest, submitted poems for every poetry club event, and I gained a small amount of celebrity amongst the students that followed in those circles. My teachers had always praised my work, but as my peers noticed my talent, I started to see this as more than a hobby. I began to believe that I might be able to make it outside of my high school community. When the spring poetry contest was announced, a contest held for students nationwide, I threw myself into it, heart and soul. I stayed up for 3 days, crafting the perfect poem, the most significant work of my life. When I hit send on the submission email, I slumped back into my chair and let the euphoria wash over me. It was Saturday night. I was exhausted after the efforts of birthing my perfect work into the world, and all I wanted to do was sleep. I crawled into bed and fell into the deep and untroubled sleep of the dead for 12 hours. I learned more about her world in those 12 hours than I wanted to. I walked through the doors of the high school and saw the ethereal backdrop of my dream again. I was comfortable here. It was comfortable here. The quiet serenity of the place was a change from the steady flow of ideas and couplets running through my head lately. But something was missing. I looked behind me, expecting to see her dodge away or hide from me, but she wasn't there. This was the only time I could remember truly being alone in this place, and it was a little strange. To feel so alien in a place that you occupy every day is a strange feeling indeed. But I felt my steps taking me steadily into the school once more, so I let myself be led wherever the dream would take me. As I walked, I was aware of a noise. The fact that there was a noise at all was strange, but the type of noise was stranger still. It was a vibration, a rhythmic thumping from under my feet, and it disturbed the place's unusual stillness. Thump, thump, thump. Then silence. A few minutes or hours or days would pass, and then it would happen again. Thump, 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 followed by a return to the same silence. As I explored the high school, I found myself drawn to the boiler room over by my civics class. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the thumping was probably coming from the boiler room. It was a large subterranean basement used by the custodians for storing extra chemicals or broken machinery that they were hoping to fix someday. It was also where students of a less academic cast went to make out or smoke between classes, since it lacked a fire alarm. When I got close to the boiler room, I heard the thumping more clearly and realized I'd been right. There was definitely something in the boiler room, something big, and I doubted it was a group of teenagers necking a little too enthusiastically. When I wrapped my hands around the door handle, though, I was immediately thrown backwards into the lockers against the far wall as something came barreling through that door. It was her, the dream girl, and she turned to glare at me, teeth bared in a feral challenge. When she saw who I was, she stopped growling and scrambled down the hall towards my English class. I sat against the lockers, my backside aching where it had connected with the lockers, and listened to something big and angry make its way up the stairs. I didn't want to know what was making that noise, but I was powerless to do anything but sit there against the lockers. I'm not one to freeze up in dreams. I'm familiar with lucid dreaming, and probably led to me becoming a little too comfortable in this dream. But as whatever it was lumbered angrily up from the depths, I realized a fear I hadn't known since childhood. The slap on my shoulder brought me out of those fears, and as the blonde girl thrust her hand at me and spoke the first few words of our strange relationship, "If you don't want to die, then you'd better start running." She offered me a hand, and a moment later, we were flying down the polished halls. As we rounded the corner, I heard something burst through the doors. It sounded like an angry piece of construction equipment as it followed us, chewing up everything that got in its way. My guide took us down a hallway that led to another hallway that led to another hallway, taking corners at random before finally wrenching open the door to the custodial closet and pushing both of us inside. She closed the door behind us, cracking it a little as she peeked out into the hallway. All I could do was lean against the wall and pant. I was tired. I didn't ever recall becoming tired in a dream before, and as I sat, I realized my butt still hurt where I had hit it. I wanted to ask things. wanted to know what was chasing us and why it was chasing us, but as the thumping footsteps got closer to our hidden cubby, I was filled once more with that sense of dread. I moved up beside her, peeking out into the hallway as a creature like nothing I had ever seen before dragged itself into view. It was shadow. It was darkness. And as its form slither crawled past us, I looked at its amorphous boundlessness. She closed the door quietly before it came even with us, and sat back in the closet as the creature moved off into a different part of the school. We sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes before I dared to speak. "What the hell was that?" She looked at me quizzically, and I feared that she was incapable of hearing me for a moment. I would later come to realize how long it had been since she had actually had anyone to talk to. She closed her eyes as I repeated my question and seemed to savor the sounds my words made. She relished them, burned them into her memory, rolled around in them like a dog with a smell that it likes. And when she'd finally absorbed them as much as possible, she answered me, "I don't know. I've been calling it shade for however long it is that I've been here." Her voice was thick with disuse, but it was cultured with just a hint of an accent that I couldn't place. She told me her name was Lisa. She told me that she believed she was 16, but she couldn't be sure. She told me that she'd been here for as long as she could remember. She told me that she could move between dreams. "Between dreams?" I asked. "What do you mean?" Instead of telling me, she showed me. Her hand looked like a starfish when she set it against the back wall of the janitor's closet. The pinkness of her skin stood out against the dingy wall and made it all the more apparent when the paint began to crumble and the wall started to melt away. Suddenly, there was sunlight in the closet, thick and buttery against the dingy darkness. We were looking at a field of flowers that stretched on to infinity. I put my hand against the image, expecting resistance, but instead fell into the landscape of fragrant Technicolor flowers. Lisa came in behind me, and as she did, the portal back to the high school closed. "Where are we?" She shrugged. "Some other dream. She has it pretty often. As long as we stay out of the area where she is, then she'll never know we're here." I had a million questions to ask her, too many to organize right away, but just as I'd found my voice again, someone was shaking me, and my mom was asking if I was hungry and might like some dinner. It was 2 weeks. 2 weeks of hoping and praying before the dream returned. I sit at the edge of a precipice, looking at the world from afar. I am a prisoner of my reality. My passage to her world has been barred. I spent those 2 weeks in a haze. I received word that my poem had gone to nationals, and I think that my distracted nature was seen as dazed relief. They thought I was happy. They thought I was living in the clouds. In my mind, however, I just wanted to go back to the dream. She needed me, and I needed to know more about her. I spent those 2 weeks analyzing what I now knew about the dream. The first was that whatever happened in the dream happened in real life. I had woken up the next morning with a large bruise on my backside and a similar bruise on my shoulder. Either I had hurt myself outside the dream, and it had translated into the dream itself, something I doubted, or I could be hurt inside the dream. The second thing was far more urgent. I needed to find out how to instigate the dream. I tried recreating the events that had led to the dream, dragging myself to the edge of collapse or overworking my mind without rest until I dropped, but it was no use. 2 weeks later, I hadn't had so much as a dream that I could remember in the little amount of sleep that I'd gotten. As I went to sleep that night, I focused all my mental faculties on the dream itself, how it had felt, the landscape I'd been in, and as I focused, I could feel my mind slipping off to sleep. I awoke in the high school again. I ran through the halls, heedless of what else might find me, and it wasn't long before she tracked me down again. She dropped into the hallway before me, seemingly from nowhere, and when she saw me, her face split into a wide grin. She ran to me, wrapping me in her arms. She smelled ethereal as I wrapped my arms around her as well, like old dust or sour memories or the universe itself. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said, and in her voice, I heard relief. Her world lies alongside my own, my dreams the key to her realm. But how did she come to reside here? Her own dreams have been overwhelmed. She took me back to the field of flowers. Then she answered my questions. I asked her probably about 1,000,000 questions as we sat together in the field. She had found a tree that sprang from the flowers, and we sat there as she told me her story. Till that moment, I believed she was older than I, maybe by as much as 5 years. But as she spoke, her girlhood came back to her. She drew her knees in close, her blonde hair creating a curtain through which she peeked at me, and she seemed embarrassed by the story. No, not embarrassed, I guess. I now realize she was afraid that telling it to me would make it real. She'd had her own dream once. She couldn't remember what had happened before it, but she could remember there being a before. She had dreamed inside a castle and was a princess, with knights and wizards at her command, dragons and goblins that needed slaying. Sometimes she had stood on the battlements and looked pretty as the knights fought for her favor. Sometimes she put on armor and killed the dragons herself, leading her knights on grand adventures. Whatever she was doing, she was happy, and the dream had returned almost every night. It returned because I wanted it to. It came back because I thought about it before bed, and so my mind opened the portal to this place. These dreams aren't normal dreams. You can get hurt in them. You can even die in them. When you dream here, your mind takes you to a place in the spirit world, the after. I don't know how, so don't ask, but I know that it is so. She had dreamed this dream for quite some time, years, she said. Then, one day, something different happened. Her knights had encountered something on the edge of her kingdom, and it had actually killed some of them. None of my knights had ever died in my dream. They would get hurt sometimes, but a wizard would always come along to heal them. When they didn't come back, and the wizard couldn't make them come back, I knew this was different. I knew this was something else. For 2 nights, it had destroyed her dream world. When it came to the castle, I was too afraid to fight it. It was dark and scary, and it just looked wrong. I hid inside the castle, unable to face it, and as it broke down my walls, I closed my eyes and tried to wake up. I tried and tried, but it wouldn't happen. And when it finally got me, I woke up somewhere else. That was when she discovered that she could make portals between dreams. She'd thrown her splayed hand out against the wall of the castle as the bulbous thing had loomed over her, and suddenly a circle had appeared in the wall. It showed a desert in the throes of a sandstorm, and she jumped through it without a second thought. She'd woken up in someone else's dream. She floats like a dandelion dreamer, adrift on the seas of a dream, never to return to her own mind, her world never to be as it seems. I visited with her often over the next few years. The dreams came almost every night, and as we explored, we grew closer. She told me that no matter how much she tried, she couldn't wake up. She could sleep, still needed to sleep actually, but as for eating and drinking, she found that she didn't need those things anymore. The bulbous creature followed her no matter where she went, but she was able to avoid it, and over time, she just became used to living inside other people's dreams. She didn't know how long she'd done it, and she didn't care. I was one of the first people to talk to her, but I was the only one who believed her, believed she was more than a figment of their imagination. This dream girl has stolen my senses. Her beauty has taken my mind. I know that life is ephemeral, but I know that her heart must be mine. I didn't acknowledge right away that I was falling for her, but I think I knew deep down. My poems became all about her, this ephemeral goddess that walked my dreams, and my fans responded. I had members of the art club asking to paint her for my description. I had droves of female fans asking me to tell them who she was. They believed that she was someone at the school that I was spending my nights with. I had people who had read my works asking about her, my moonlight girlfriend, but I gave them very little information. For her part, I could tell that she appreciated my company, but she seemed afraid to get too close to me. As months became years, she showed me sights that defied description. She took me to dreamscapes so beautiful that I could hardly grasp them, and to places so wondrous I could scarcely describe them. But she refused to tell me what she was looking for. Her hand would creep into mine on occasions, though, and I remembered being filled with a warmth each time she touched me. Inevitably, our nights would be cut short by the appearance of the shadow creature. He would blunder upon us and screamily suck his way around, groping, as we would flee until he moved away. She never fought him and said it would be useless to try, but I somehow knew that she would never really be safe as long as it existed. As time passed, I noticed her become more and more melancholy. The one night I asked what was troubling her, she took my hand, interlocking our fingers, and looked at me across what seemed like 1,000 years. "I don't want this to be my life anymore. I want to hold your hand, feel its texture, and know that I won't be left alone when the dawn comes. I want to leave this place. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder for the shadow creature. I want a life." She sounded so sad, so adrift, but I had no idea how to help her. She longs to leave her forever, this kingdom ethereum so deep. She wishes to walk in the moonlight, to walk her own dreams as she sleeps. I was in my senior year when she left forever. I came into the dream high school that I'd come to know so well, and found her sitting in an empty classroom. She was seated in one of the desks, and at first I thought she was asleep. When she turned to look at me, though, I could see that she was deep in contemplation. She looked up at me with real hope, and I realized that something had happened while I was gone. I think I need to destroy the shade. She detailed her plans, how if she killed it, she might be allowed to go back to her dream and wake up. But all I could hear was the first lines of her suicide note. I tried to reason with her, talk her out of this needless waste of life, but she wouldn't hear of it. I had clearly underestimated her resolve, and every argument against it only seemed to infuriate her more. "I thought you were different. I thought you understood how important this was to me. Well, to hell with you then. I'm going, with or without you." She walked out, and I let her go, unable to say any more. When I woke up, I found myself fighting sleep for the next few days. By then, I was almost out of high school, about to start college, in fact, and my poems had appeared in magazines and compilations since early in the year. I woke up to my familiar bedroom and immediately went to find a cup of coffee. For the next 4 days, I drank coffee, took caffeine pills. My face stung from where I had slapped it, and I fought the urge to sleep. I didn't want to go back to that place and see what had happened to her. The thought that she was dead scared me, but the thought that she might become something worse after she killed the shade scared me even more. Eventually, I lost the battle, and I was forced to submit to sleep. When I returned to the halls, it was like the first time. I felt no one. The silence was oppressive. In the ethereal halls, I wonder, the only sounds are my own. I listen for her, but hear nothing. I find myself all alone. I searched for her for hours. I combed the school, every classroom, every mop closet, from the library to the gym, but she was nowhere to be found. I quickly found myself running through the halls, calling her name as I threw caution to the wind, wanting nothing but the solace of her voice, of her presence. I wanted to see her, to know she was okay, to apologize for my cowardice, a cowardice I was still indulging even then. I would not let myself think about the cellar. But I'm past that now. I'm going to find her. Tonight, I'm going into that basement to settle this once and for all. My parents will likely find this, as well as my last poem, and if they do, I hope they send it to my editor so he can publish what will likely be my last work. I'm going in there. I'm going to bring Lisa out, or I'm going to die trying. I will have my dream girl. I won't go back to work tomorrow. I don't care what Jack says and how much he threatens to tell my probation officer. I will not hear the way my coworkers laugh at me. They tell me it's nothing, but they didn't see what I saw. They haven't seen the spot like I did today. Yeah, I did a little time. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not going to bullshit anybody and tell them a lie. I got a little too drunk one night and assaulted someone in a bar. It was my first offense, and I did my 2 years without much hassle. Hell, they even let me do the last year at work release, so I could keep paying my parents' mortgage for them. I have experience in construction, so it was a good fit. They set me up with a crew, doing drywall and laying flooring, and I worked for a good bunch of guys. It was a sweet gig, and it was a gig I was told I could keep after I got released. On the day I was released, I told them I'd see them in a few days and rejoin the real world. That, however, was the night my dad suffered a stroke. It was a bad one. Mom woke me up screaming, and we took him to the hospital in the back of an ambulance. Suddenly there were doctors to talk to, changes to make to the house I'd grown up in, and a man who'd once taken care of me to take care of. He'd lost function in nearly half his body, and with Mom feeling very overwhelmed, it became my job to take care of Dad. It wasn't until my probation officer informed me that I was in danger of violating my probation that I realized it had been almost a month since I'd been released. I understand that you've got some things going on, but you have to maintain employment as part of your probation. Your job with a construction firm says that they'll let you come back if you're still interested, but you have to have some income coming in by next week or risk violating your probation and going back to prison. I went to the foreman the next day to see if I could get my old job back, but it appeared I was in for a surprise. Yeah, sorry, we filled your spot on that crew. We didn't know if you were coming back, and we needed a full crew for the job. I gritted my teeth and resist the urge to rage at him. Then why did you tell the probation officer I could come back? 'Cause I have a new crew for you, if you're still interested in it. I told him I was, and he gave me a number to call. That's Jack. He's been begging for another able body. Give him a call and see if you guys can meet up today. I thanked him, inwardly fuming that he'd already filled my position, and called the number. Jack answered on the third ring and told me that his crew left at 5 a.m. If I wanted a spot on it, I'd better be on the yard at 5 a.m., ready to work. I told him I would, and he hung up on me mid-sentence. I already didn't have a good feeling about this guy. He was terse, and didn't sound like the kind of guy you wanted to have a beer with after work. Regardless, I needed the work, so I set my alarm the night before and dragged up before dawn to meet this asshole at the yard at 5 a.m. And oh boy, had I been right in my hunch about this guy. Jack was one of those average-sized dudes who thinks he's a giant, the kind of guy who gets his ass beat in prison. He wore jeans and a sleeveless t-shirt, with a gold chain that hung down into his thick chest hair. His hair was held in place with enough grease to change the oil in my car, and I saw him single me out the second I showed up. He had a small crew, maybe 10 guys, but the way he zoned in on me let me know that he'd been looking for me. Well, you actually showed up. Rick may speak highly of you, but I'm not just going to drop somebody down so some ex-con can have a job. You'll be cleaning the job site until I'm convinced that you're not going to show up high or just dip out in the middle of the day. If that's not okay with you, then you're going to go tell your probation officer to send you back where you came from. He turned and walked away, the crew piling into his truck as I stood there in stunned silence. I had to remind myself that I needed this job as I piled into the back of the truck with them. I had to remind myself a lot over the next few hours that Mom and Dad needed me home and not back in prison. We pulled up outside this dumpy-looking house in the suburbs just as the sun started to come up over the horizon. It was an old 2-story with a peeling exterior and a yard that looked like it had last been mowed during the Bush administration. They had made a pathway up to the walk so that they could bring in their tools, and the grass looked stomped flat by the constant traffic. They had set up a generator near the porch, and a big metal dumpster created an island in the grass where they had just rolled it off and dropped it. All in all, it was a sloppy-looking sight, but I was in no position to throw stones. Jack collected us up on the porch so he could give out assignments. The old house was being renovated so the company could flip it, and he set several of us to ripping up carpet. After assignments were given, Jack and 3 others went upstairs to assess the damage, and I didn't see them come back until after lunch. I was set to pulling carpet in the downstairs living room. It was a dingy little room with a pair of small windows that reminded me of eyes. The carpet was disgusting, covered in hair and crumbs, and it was tacky like old soda had been spilled on it. I was sliding on my gloves when someone threw a crowbar on the floor and walked off. "Hey, aren't you going to help me?" I asked. but the guy who tossed the crowbar just shook his head. "We each get a room. This one's yours, so get to it." Then they left me to pull carpet in this big dirty room by myself. The living room wasn't huge, but it was still a lot to ask of one person. I pressed the crowbar in and pulled the carpet away from the wall, not bothering to be gentle. The drywall was going to be pulled out next, and I suddenly wondered why they were pulling the carpet out first. I shrugged. I wasn't the boss here, so I guess I just have to do as I was told. That was the first time I noticed the spot. It was in the corner of the living room, a big water stain that seemed to take up 2 walls. It was about the size of a basketball, and the water spot looked like it would be wet if you touched it. It kind of freaked me out, for some reason, though I couldn't tell you why at the time. As I worked, I could almost swear it was moving, just a little, and I got that feeling like eyes on the back of my neck. You know the feeling, the one that makes your hair prickle up, the one that makes you think you might be being watched. I tried not to let it bug me, but it was like I could feel that spot as I worked. The carpet didn't take too long. An hour later, I had rolled it up and was ready to haul it out. I looked around for help, but the others were still hard at it, or at least pretending to be. I could see 3 of them sitting around smoking or chatting for every one guy working. When I asked them to help me get the carpet out to the dumpster, they just scoffed and waved me off. I couldn't move it by myself, so I just left it in the living room and went to look for more carpet to pull. It seemed that my fellow workers weren't as diligent as I was, because there was still carpet in 3 rooms that seemed to need removing. I sighed. This was clearly going to be my life for a while, and I set to work pulling the carpet to get ready to haul it all out. As I worked in a bedroom, the wall painted off blue with stormy-looking clouds on it, I got the feeling that someone was watching me. I turned to the door, thinking maybe one of my coworkers had come to see who was making so much noise back here, but there was no one. I looked to the window, but it was so caked with dust that no one could have seen anything through it. I glanced over to the closet, thinking maybe someone was lurking in there, and that was when I saw the source of my discomfort. A basketball-shaped spot on the wall over the closet door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was just a water spot. The house was probably full of them, and I just happened to have found one that looked exactly like the other one I had seen. I kept working, pulling up tack strips in places, but it still felt funny, like something was watching me. As the carpet rolled up, I began to push it towards the door, sending up puffs of smoke as it thumped over. As I pushed, I couldn't help but glance at that spot. It was still there, hanging over the closet door, seeming to watch me as I worked. I turned to look at it squarely and gasped as I noticed a large white hole in the middle of the spot, like an eye floating in a puddle. I ran out of the room then, bumping into another worker as I beat a hasty retreat. "There you are," he said tersely. "We've been looking for you. Come help us move this carpet." I was more than happy to oblige, anything to get out of that room, and we spent the rest of the morning hefting carpet. We pulled it to the dumpster, tossing it in haphazardly, and then assessed the work for tomorrow. As we broke for lunch, I had almost forgotten about the spot. People being around me made me feel a little crazy about being afraid of it, but as we worked, I could swear I saw it again and again. The walls were covered in stains. The pipes were likely bad, but this one was definitely the same spot. It had the same wobbly edges and deep black center as the one I'd seen the first time. The white circle was gone, though, but I still found myself looking for it when I was in a room. The guys on the crew must have noticed because they started making jokes about how prison had made me jumpy. "He's got to check all the corners when he comes in to make sure no booty bandits are lurking," a big, slovenly one in overalls would say, and they'd all laugh like it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. If I didn't need this job so bad, I'd have made something of it. We moved upstairs eventually, finding 2 bedrooms and a bathroom that needed carpet or flooring removed. By 5 o'clock, we had all the carpet out of the house and in the dumpster out front. Jack came back in a truck, handing out paychecks and thanking the guys for their hard work. When he came to me, he handed me the check grudgingly, scowling the whole time and holding it when I tried to take it from him. "Tomorrow I expect some real work out of you, not just half-assing it like you did today." I took the check and walked off. I'd find my own way back. The next day was a little better. Jack said that the drywall would come next, and then he and his cronies disappeared out to the truck while the rest of us worked. We all started tearing out drywall, dust and nails flying, and I meant to swing my hammer into that spot extra hard when I saw it. To my disappointment, though, the spot never showed up. I'd seen it everywhere yesterday, seen it in every room at least once, but today it was absent. We spent the day tearing out drywall and cleaning up after ourselves. When 5 o'clock came, we packed up and went out to get paid. Today had been better. Nothing builds camaraderie like a little hard work, and I found myself joining in on the jokes and conversation that happened in the group. We were covered in drywall dust as we walked out that afternoon, laughing about how Tony had been scared by a rat when it burst out of the drywall in the laundry room. Jack looked at them coldly, affronted that they had accepted me so easily. He handed me my check in silence, and I piled into the back of the truck with the others this time. The next day was the last day I'd get to work with them. We spent that day hanging drywall downstairs. Between the 10 of us, we worked diligently and quickly. The drywall went up a sheet at a time, something I was pretty good at, and I was glad to see it covered the hollow studs and the newly blown out insulation. We marked a few spots where the beams were rotten, but the pipes actually looked pretty good, as did the electrical. I began to wonder what had made the spots I kept seeing. They looked so wet, but I pushed it out of my mind as I worked beside my newfound companions. By 5 o'clock, we'd done most of the downstairs, and we'd have the rest finished by tomorrow so we could move upstairs. When I walked out onto the porch, though, I realized I'd forgotten something. I had rubbed at my wrist, looking for the reassuring feel of metal that had gotten me through 2 years in the can, but I found only bare skin. My heart skipped a beat. My dad's watch was gone. When I remembered that I had laid it on the counter, not wanting it damaged while I was working, I must have forgotten all about it in the bustle. I grabbed my check and turned to go back in the house, Jack scowling at me as I walked off. "We're leaving," he called to my back, but I waved him off. "If you're gone when I get back, I'll just find my own way." I wasn't about to leave my watch here overnight. I went to the kitchen and checked the counter, but there was nothing there. It was powdery with dust from today's work, and I thought I could see an indent where the watch had been. I checked underneath the counters and around the floor, but I couldn't find my watch. I began to look around, hoping it hadn't found its way into someone else's pocket. I walked through the rooms, looking into each of them, to see if I'd maybe left it there, and when I looked into the living room, I was rewarded for my effort. Sitting in the dead center of the debris-riddled floor was my missing watch. I took a step, but something brought me up short. A little tickle on the back of my head told me that it was a little too convenient. It was like a trap baited with something for an unlucky animal to blunder into. I shook it off. I wanted my watch, damn it, and I wasn't going to just abandon it because I had a hinky feeling. I bent down to get it, wrapping my fingers around the cold metal, when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was pulsating, sludgy, something that I had seen soaking into the new drywall. I looked up exasperated, figuring that someone had put a nail through a pipe at some point today, but what I saw drew me up short. I was left half bent, filled with fear, as I saw the oozy black spot seething on the drywall. It was bigger than a basketball now, its inky depth seeming to beat like a heart. As I watched, I could see 2 white circles materializing out of the soup. They rolled around like lost eggs, and finally came to rest in the middle of the sludge. I wanted to run. I didn't want to see whatever was in that thing, but I was trapped like a deer in headlights. I felt my breath hitching in my chest, and could only wait for my legs to regain their strength. The white orbs rolled around in the soup and became eyes. They blinked at me, their centers trained on me as I bent there. All at once, a Cheshire cat smile floated under them as it beamed at me. I was stuck looking into that inky hole, the edges dribbling down the fresh drywall as it oozed and ran. Suddenly, I was sure that part of that darkness was ahead with the eyes that were looking out at me from whatever inky void it inhabited, maybe with hands that wanted to pull me into that dark hole it inhabited. As if it had read my mind, I saw dark hands grip the edges of the spot, trying to pull itself out and enter my world. It never lost eye contact as it pulled itself out, and I could see the vague outline of its head as it came free of the spot with that placental pop. It was all I needed to see. Suddenly my legs were moving in overtime. My heart was racing like a steam engine. and I was out the door and slamming it behind me before I could quite remember how I had gotten onto the porch. Even through the blood pounding in my ears and the rubber of my sneakers pounding on the wooden floor, something else dominated my hearing, and there was one sound that I would never forget. I may not be able to remember how I came to be on the porch, heaving and gasping for air, but I do remember the sound I heard just before I threw the door open and I was free. It was a plop and a splatter, similar to a bucket of paint being emptied on the ground. I ran home, calling Jack as I took off up the sidewalk. He picked up on the second ring. "I'm not coming back for you. I told you that I was..." "Jack, you gotta get somebody back to the site. Someone's there." "Who?" Jack asked, and I could hear his skepticism. "If this is some kind of goof, I don't get it." I told him how I'd gone back for my watch and I'd seen someone skulking about the site. I didn't tell him about the oozing hole in the wall. He'd see that. However, I did tell him that I had thought the guy might be on drugs, so he should probably be careful. He was banging his fists on the drywall, so I booked it, I finished, trying to keep it believable. The crew was just starting to warm up to me, and I didn't want them to think I was a nut job. "Jesus Christ, I thought you ex-cons were tough. I'll go have a look. You just stay home. I'll let you know what I find." That was hours ago. Since I got home, I've been in my room, waiting on Jack to call, and I decided to write this while I waited. When I opened my laptop, though, my desire to get this down became all the more prevalent. As I slid it open, I caught a glimpse behind me and realized that I'll be fortunate if I have time to finish this tale. I could see a basketball-sized hole reflected in the screen of my laptop. I got up and locked the door and moved my writing to the living room. I don't know if the locked door will stop whatever may come from that dribbling hole, but I know that it may give me enough time to finish this before it breaks the surface. Keep your eyes peeled for water spots. You never know what might come slipping out. I have acquired Khazar the Amazing, issue 237 to be exact, and it scares the crap out of me. I'm a collector of rare comics. Well, not really a collector, I guess. I never keep them for very long, you see. I prefer to sell the comics for big bucks. I buy them from Goodwill and garage sales and estate sales, anywhere I can pick them up cheap, really. I'm in it for the profit, pure and simple. But today, I may have found something that I wasn't quite prepared for. Briarcliff Estates was having an estate sale, and I knew that there would be some interesting pieces there. Mr. Briar had died at the ripe old age of 103 and was said to be a notorious pack rat. His wife and son had died years ago, both under mysterious circumstances, and Briarcliff had gained an air of mystery ever since. It was said that his house was full of things, everything from antiques and collectibles to, well, downright garbage, and I wanted to have a look. The sale was even grander than I had expected. There were halls cluttered with antique furniture, shelves full of old books, antique kitchen appliances, Persian rugs, strange art, odd articles from around the world. All the trash had been cleared away, and all the items for sale had been tagged and were on display. A large crowd had gathered, and I was more than a little interested in some of the books for my shop. The auction seemed like a total waste of time, though, right up until the last lot. The antique furniture went first, then the old cars from the garage, then the rugs and the appliances, and the strange antiquities. Some of them were pretty grisly. Apparently, Mr. Briar had been a world traveler in his youth. He had collected things from Africa, Russia, Germany, China, all of them with an eye towards the occult. I actually found myself bidding on a wand made of pure ivory, something my Harry Potter fans would have doubtlessly paid a lot of money for. But a stuffy old man in the front row shelled out about $100,000 for it, and I sat down and shut up after that. He had long white hair and an imposing beard that hung down past the waist of his immaculate gray suit. He was a jarring comparison to the toad-faced man with the all-black oiled hair on his head that sat on the far side of the hall. They seemed to know each other, know and hate each other. They had several hard looks for each other as they held their complicated bidding war, and their battles bled over into the books as well. They snapped up most of the books, old moldering things with hard-to-pronounce names, and my bids were mostly shouted over as the two dueled for the remaining tomes. Most everyone else had gone, seeing that these two meant to have the lot. So, when the last lot came up and turned out to be a box of comics, I immediately threw out a bid of $25. I hadn't expected to see any comics here, my focus being on the antique books, but this seemed to be the only thing that these two weirdos didn't want. The bid went once, went twice, and then sold as the two glared at each other from across the room. I took my box of dusty old comics and scuttled off before either of them could realize that I had been there. I didn't realize what I had until I got home. I took them to my office and set to work. First a shower, then a change of clothes. Old comics can be finicky, and I like to be comfy when I appraise them. Then the gloves came on, a nice set of reusable rubber ones, and I put on a hairnet too. Can't be too careful with old comics. After I was set, I opened the box and had a look. I was not immediately impressed. Mr. Breyer, it appeared, had a thing for old Hanna-Barbera comics. There were some Yogi Bears, about 10 Huckleberry Hounds, some Tom and Jerry's, and a few wacky racer comics that I'd never even heard of. I set those aside. Hanna-Barbera comics never retail very high, unless you have some of the rarer pieces, that is. They were all in bags, though, and looked to be in pretty good shape, so I could at least get asking price for them. Next came some old Johnny Quest comics, and they also went to the side. Then I pulled out some old detective comics that looked to be from the early 40s run. They were bagged and looked to be in great shape. I set those on the desk by the computer. Looked like my purchase wouldn't be entirely in vain. There were some other things in there, some well-loved action comics, a few Batman issues from the late 60s, and a single issue of a comic series that I had never heard of. Sitting at the bottom of the box in a plastic sleeve that looked to be caked with dust and, maybe soda, I guess, was a copy of Khazar the Amazing, issue 237. I had never heard of Khazar the Amazing, and he appeared to be some sort of magician detective or something. I was also unfamiliar with Keystone Comics and decided to go do some research. As I brought it over to the computer, though, I felt a strong urge to drop it and just walk away. The comic felt weird, even through the gloves, and the bag was tacky in a way that soda usually wasn't. I don't know how to describe it. It was like the comic didn't want to be held. I shrugged it off at the time, but I can feel it now as it sits on the nightstand beside my computer. It doesn't want me to touch it. I looked up Khazar and found that it was part of a debut series from Keystone Comics. Khazar was in fact the only comic series they had put out, and it had a very limited run. Less than 500 issues of each comic were ever made, and they were extremely rare and not often seen at auction. Issue 237 was actually the last issue ever printed before Keystone Comics burned to the ground in 1975. The fire was supposedly investigated and ruled as an accident, despite 4 people having perished in the blaze. Chuck Landstar, the owner, and the writer of Khazar, his assistant, Mike Dre, and the illustrators who worked on the comic, Jug and Dale Trebolo, had all been killed in the fire. The series had never seen the light of day again. Apparently this issue had less than the usual amount on the run. Even in its ratty condition, it was worth over $1,000. Cha-ching. $25 for $1,000 seemed like a great deal to me, and who knew what kind of bidding war I could get on this thing. I gingerly removed it from the bag and threw it away, as no customer would want it in that state. The comic itself was ragged, the spine bent, some of the page corners damaged or missing. The pages themselves looked pretty good, old but good, until I got to a spot near the back. Towards the end, Khazar appears to be casting some sort of spell to summon an ancient deity. He stood in the middle of the circle, laid with etchings and stone runes, and I could see quite a few bodies laying around as well. Some of them seemed intricate and embellished enough to make me think they might be the main characters he'd sacrificed. But I knew nothing of the series, so I could only speculate. There was a dark-haired woman in a slinky dress that barely contained her assets, a blonde guy with a loincloth and a skull helmet, a young boy in a red cloak, and another less buxom redhead that seemed to have died holding hands with the kid. They were all laid out in a circle, and their deaths seemed to have been unkind. Khazar was kneeling, resplendent in his yellow and green robes, as he made his request before the towering form on the horned helm. Its eyes were coals beneath the visor, and its green armor was stained with ancient blood. It sat atop a bone-white horse, steam curling from its nostrils as it brandished a sword at Khazar that looked big enough to cut him in half. Khazar was making his request, but the words had been smudged. The figure on the horse didn't sit right with me. Even through the page, I could feel his regard. It was like he was looking at me, judging me, weighing my worth. I closed the comic. No sense getting spooked by some old comic, I told myself with a laugh. I took some pictures next, showing the damage, and put it into a new protective bag. I uploaded the pictures to Comic Squire, the service I use to sell comics, and sat back to wait. I pulled some of the other comics I had piled up towards me and started looking them over so I could post them as well. One of the detective comics was worth about $40. That was cool. Another was worth about $30. Excellent. And I heard a ding from my computer and looked up to see that Khazar had an opening bid of $500. I typed a message to the buyer, someone named Nilrim, informing him that I was firm on $800 and went back to the other comics. Two of the detectives were so much hamster cage liner, but I saved them aside so I could put them with the bulk lot. Two more were worth about $30, and I just started looking up the seventh when my computer dinged again. I looked up to see that the same buyer was offering $800, the price I listed it for, and I nodded and turned back to my work. The bid would sit on the site for an hour, allowing others to bid if they wanted, but I figured this guy would get it, and I would be $800 the richer. I'd barely gotten the seventh comic out of the bag when my computer dinged again. A new bid had come in for $1,000. I checked the buyer, and this time it was a new guy named Morgul. He was offering an extra $50 for overnight shipping. That made me raise an eyebrow, but I suppose he wanted to make sure it arrived undamaged. After all, this was a rare comic, and I sent him a message accepting his offer should he win. I had barely sent the message when Nilrim got back to me with $1,200. This went on for a few hours, and as the bids went up, the bidders began to message me. That was when things got bizarre. From Morgul. Dearest seller, the user Nilrim is trying to purchase your wares under false pretense. He is my rival and merely wants to own the comic so that I cannot. I implore you to award the sale to me and ship with all haste. His wording was strange, but it was nothing compared to what his rival was about to send me. From Nilrim. I must ask that you not sell this piece to Morgul. He wants it not for scholarly endowments, but for his power, and it will bring him much. I must have this item so that it can be sealed away from those who might use it for ill. Thank you. I furrowed my brow at this one. Sealed away from those that might use it for ill. It was a damn comic book. I had barely finished reading the message when I saw that Morgul had sent me another message. From Morgul. I see that you have not offered me my preference in this matter. Has Nilrim offered you something more in return for this item? I assure you I will match whatever offer he makes, no matter the cost. That took me by surprise. These guys were clearly serious collectors, or weirdos, and they could likely pay big money for it. I didn't have to do anything. All I had to do was stay quiet and let these two drive the price up on their own. Simple economics. They wanted it, I had it. Suddenly this ratty comic was looking like a cash cow to me. Even then, I hadn't realized the real value of the piece. I heard the computer ding as a new message from Nilrim came up. Please, I implore you not to be swayed by Morgul's boasting. If he gets the tome, it will be devastating for our world. I implore you to sell it to me. Money is no object. Name your price, and I will pay it. I sucked in air through my teeth, my small pile of potential profits forgotten. This fellow had basically written me a blank check. How much would be too much? He had said that money was no object, but there was always a limit. I looked back at the sale and realized that Nilrim had just placed a bid for $50,000. Morgul quickly countered with 60, and the two went right on sparring as I watched. I pulled up Nilrim's message again, and that was when I realized that his profile had a picture attached. I clicked on it and realized that this was the same guy from the auction today. This picture was of a grandfatherly-looking man, long white hair and beard that was downright Gandalf-esque. He was in profile in the picture, just his head and shoulders, but I was willing to bet it was the same guy. This Morgul character was likely the other man, the one who had looked like a toad and been afflicted with all that greasy black hair. They were just continuing their antics from the auction, and I was surprised they had any money left after all the crap they had bought earlier. Another message from Nilrim came in, and this one had a link at the bottom to a new site. This must end. Morgul must not be allowed to own this spell. See what it has wrought last time it was unleashed upon the world. The link brought up an article about Briarcliff Estate. 4 bodies had been found on the grounds nearly 20 years ago. They had been arrayed in the garden, the photos looking very similar to the one in Khazar, minus the bodies, of course. Those had been replaced with tape outlines, but their placement was undeniable. Briar's wife, teenage daughter, nephew, and the brother that had been killed in what seemed like a cult activity. Briar had immediately been the first one to be suspected, but some combination of money and alibis given out of fear had cleared him. Still, his reputation in the community had been well earned. Had Briar made a deal with that horned demon? Had Briar possibly discovered something that had led him to fill his hallways with junk in an attempt to insulate himself from whatever might come for him? I saw I had a message from Morgul, a message with his final offer. The link in his message was of a Google Maps location. It was my address. His last message was much less formal and much less pleasant than the others had been. I'm coming for what's mine. See you soon. I've been sitting in my office writing all this down for the past hour. I've locked the doors and called the police, but they don't seem to be taking this very seriously. The numbers on the bid haven't gone up in an hour, and even though Nilrim had won, I'm afraid he's never going to get what he paid for. I can see someone moving in the yard outside the window, but when I try to call the police, it just rings and rings. I don't know what to do. I can almost feel this comic watching me, even as whatever's outside keeps moving around out there. The sun will be going down soon. I wonder if they'll find my body here or by some circle in a garden somewhere. I was speechless when she sent me the message. Even her text looked sexy in the pink curly writing she used. It was short and sweet and to the point, but it still filled my chest with a tightness that wouldn't go away. At the time, it was a dream come true. Meet me at the Hotel Ares at 11 p.m. Don't be late. I couldn't believe this was happening. Tonight, I would meet with Lady Dragora. I guess you could say I have a slight problem with weird fetishes. I discovered pornography when I was young, like most people I know. I was 12, I was horny, and someone I knew said I could find boobs online if I looked. I dived headfirst into a well I don't think I really understood the depths of. It started with generic stuff, naked photos, short clips from films, and led to my current level of kink. I started slow, it was the 90s after all, and internet connections were not what they would become. I have waited all day for a single picture to load, only to be disappointed when the phone rang and everything was lost. Most of my early burgeonings were done in chat rooms, in the steamy squares of private messages. With both of my parents away at work, I was on the computer every day after school. I didn't discover my proclivity for vor until I was in college. When you've been cruising the web for as long as I have, you eventually find yourself into some offbeat stuff. You can't experience that much depravity and not be changed fundamentally, and I was no different. I had recently grown bored with my selection of smut and went looking for something different. When I found vor, though, I knew I had found something special. Vor, if you're unfamiliar, is a fetish that centers around eating or being eaten by something. In the community of niche communities, vor is pretty niche. I belong to several online communities where we discuss the acts and the aftermath and trade images online. But I only know a few people in my area who are into it. We meet up once a week to have coffee and gush over our favorite vor videos and whatnot, and gush over our local legend, Lady Dragora. Lady Dragora was a legend in the vor scene. She had a subreddit devoted to her videos, a Snapchat full of fans who hungered for her next performance, and a legion of fans willing to pay exorbitant fees for her live shows and recordings. She wouldn't tell people her age, but most of us guess she's in her 30s. She has this long, dark hair that falls in straight waves of ebony silk, and her eyes hold the slight hint of some Asian parentage maybe. She's beautiful, she's exotic, and she was a total sadist. Lady Dragora made the kind of videos that were illegal everywhere. She made the sort of videos that came with a price tag payable in cryptocurrency. I had seen other so-called vor videos before her, but many were obviously fake, obviously staged, or obviously CGI. People would eat mice only to have a jump cut before they started chewing. They would dangle CGI mice over their gaping maws. They would pretend to eat things or eat things they were pretending were alive. And after a while, it just becomes a little old. Her videos were something different. The first video I ever saw involved her eating a rat the size of her hand. The video opened on a terrarium full of squirming rats, not mice, sewer rats. And as she approached the tank, they all began to go wild. They ran over the top of each other, squealing in pure terror. It was as though they sensed a bigger predator coming and wanted to be sure her eyes didn't fall on them. She was dressed in what would become her signature black bodice, garters, black choker, black elbow-length gloves, and long leather knee-high boots. Some videos seemed to require music laid over the top, but not hers. When she reached inside the tank, you could hear the rats screaming and flailing inside as they tried desperately to avoid her hand. She selected one of them and pulled him out with a gloved hand. The rat squirmed and kicked, visibly distressed by her, but she paid him no mind. She replaced the lid and walked away from the tank with the screaming rodent. Their cries were high-pitched, almost pig-like, and you could hear them off camera in low waves. The video cut to her, holding the rat up to the camera, still squirming and biting as it struggled to free itself. She held it too tight in her clenched fist, and its fur seemed to boil around that fist like water overflowing a glass. I expected a jump cut when she opened her mouth and leaned over the rat's head. It screamed pitifully as her teeth encircled its writhing head. He bit at her, lashing out with those sharp teeth, but if she felt it, she seemed not to notice. It spasmed as her teeth began to close around its head, and I watched, thinking to myself that the jump cut would be any minute now. This will be when the video jags and her teeth will close around a plastic rat. She'll be just another pretender, just another charlatan, just another... The blood flowed out as the rat made its final scream. Her teeth sank into it and tore at its skin. When she came away, she was chewing, and the rat's body twitched in her hand as she ate. The twitching stopped before she went back for another bite, but the blood made a macabre sort of fountain as it ran down her gloved fingers and pattered to the floor. She ate the whole rat, one bite at a time, bones and all, and as the tail disappeared down her throat, I was hooked. I'd probably watched about a dozen of her videos before I dared to show anyone. Sometimes she bit, which was hot, but sometimes it seemed that she would just swallow whatever she was eating whole. She'd worry it down with very little difficulty, her throat bulging as whatever it was slid down, and to me, that was more erotic than the chewing. It wasn't just rodents either. Eels, mice, more rats, chicks, they all went down her throat, while my friends and I paid $79.99 a video. 2 months ago, she put a small camera on a mouse and swallowed it whole while videoing its descent into her stomach. The camera must have cost her quite a bit. Between the size of the camera, the night vision interface, and the video's price, I knew it wouldn't be something we could expect often. The footage changed the way I'd viewed my fetish. Watching something struggle in her stomach, watching its final moments, was far more intimate than watching her swallow it whole. I told her as much on the comment section of her website. I spilled my guts to her, hoping to impress her, and somehow it worked. I wish I knew what would come of that stupid comment. I was shocked when she responded. I'd been sitting at the coffee bar with the other members of our group, Doug and Matt and David. We were all discussing the latest video by Lady D when my phone chirped loudly. I looked down to check it and saw a banner informing me that Lady Dragora has responded to your comment. I almost spewed hot coffee on Doug before opening the message and reading what she'd written. The guys leaned in close, wondering what I'd seen to garner such attention, and when he saw the sender, he too almost spit coffee in surprise. I opened her message, and it said 8 short words. How profound. I would love to chat sometime. Dave whistled through his teeth. Wow, she rarely talks to fans. You're in, man. And so I was. As they sat crowded around me, I answered her, and she immediately began our strange correspondence. I didn't question it at the time, but the speed with which she picked up our conversations should have triggered a red flag or two. It was as though she were just waiting for me to respond, waiting for her prey to wander into her field of influence so she could snap the trap shut and watch it squirm. For 3 months, we chatted almost every day. We talked about everything: music, food, the usual getting to know you stuff. We eventually made it to topics that were a little more personal. It turned out that she held some strange beliefs about life force, believed that consuming the flesh of living creatures would give her their life force and extend her own life somehow. I asked her if she'd ever eaten human flesh, but she just joked that maybe I'd find out someday and danced around the subject. The more I talked to her, the more I became certain that she had traveled much and knew things that I could only guess at. She spoke about distant places and strange customs. If I hadn't been so enchanted by the attention of a celebrity, I might have seen the numerous red flags she was putting up. She talked a lot about places you didn't see on the Travel Channel, sites that didn't have names you could scroll across a map, locations both ancient and remote. A month ago, she asked me if I would roleplay with her. I agreed, of course, because I was hooked on her attention. Even in my haze of glamour, though, I knew there was something a little off. Her persona was that of a large reptile, and mine was always of some prey animal fit only for ingestion. She would describe my end, my passing between large and ancient lips, and my slow descent towards the transition into nutrition. I would describe my struggles, my vain attempts at escape, but she would always catch me and describe in loving detail my demise at her jaws. I loved it. After all, this was my thing, and I often walked away from our sessions with a bounce in my step. People probably had a hard time understanding how someone achieves satisfaction at the idea of being devoured, but to me, it was no different than any other obsession. We would roleplay twice a week, her scenarios and story threads becoming darker as they went, and before long, she wasn't just swallowing me whole, but tearing into me and getting a little violent. I was less on board with these instances. Imagining myself going through these pains were never my thing, but she always smoothed it over with personalized videos or custom works just for me. She made me feel special, made me feel accepted, and that's what made it easy to draw me in. This was also when I was approached by Justin. His screen name was Furrylocks on the board in question. Until he messaged me, I'd never even heard of him, though it seemed we moved in similar circles. My only correspondence with him was a message left in my inbox one morning. It was hastily written, full of spelling errors, and intrigued me to no end. I read it twice before class, and when I showed it to my friends in the Vor group, they brushed it off as a jealous fan. His message was not long, but it did make me question some rumors I'd heard on some of the other boards. It read, "You don't know me. My name is Justin. I understand that you've become close with an internet personality known as Lady Dragora. I don't know how much you know about her, but she may or may not be 100% what she seems to be. I had a friend whom I'd known since grade school. He caught the attention of the lady, and it was the happiest I'd ever seen him. Their relationship was brief, a month or two. Then one night, he told me she'd invited him to her hotel room. I didn't think anything of it until he didn't respond to my calls or texts for 2 days. He's been missing for 3 months now, and your new lady friend has either blocked me or refused to respond to any of my messages. I'm not trying to turn you away from your current relationship, whatever that might entail. I'm simply trying to warn you to be on your guard." I was hesitant to respond. It seemed better to just ignore him, but after a particularly grisly RP session a week later, I decided to message him and get some information. I was still very much under her spell, but some of our conversations had made me wary. After all, she was still a stranger on the internet. Growing up at an age of stranger danger, I was very wary of people online pretending to be someone they weren't, a collection of online videos or not. However, my message was never opened, never read, and when the invitation to her hotel room came across my box, I decided to put my fears aside and go for it. That's how I came to be in her hotel room at 11 p.m. She sent me the text around 6 in the afternoon. "Meet me at the Hotel Aries at 11 p.m. Don't be late," was all it said, but it was enough to get my blood running hot. The Hotel Aries was not a huge hotel, but it was one of the largest in this part of Chicago. The borough of Chicago was an hour from campus, but I drove the distance gladly. If she told me to drive to New York that night, I'd have done it. And with the invitation being so close to home, I decided I would be a fool not to accept. I told my friends from the coffee shop where I was going. They told me to take some video and let me know when they got home. I set out for the hotel in high spirits, my mind flooded with possibilities. I had arrived early, 2 hours early, hoping that maybe we could have a meal before whatever was going to happen tonight. I inquired at the front desk, and the man behind the counter gave me a knowing little smile as he slid the key card across to me. "She's gone out for a little while, but she mentioned that she likely had a guest coming tonight." "Have fun," he said. I started up to the elevator, wondering how often he'd had to do this for her. How often did she have guests? I took the elevator up to the penthouse and found a lavish one-bedroom suite decked out in rich fabrics and expensive furniture. I recognized it as the backdrop for many of her videos and found a camera already set up in the corner. She had left me a note, too, telling me to make myself at home and that she would be back at 11. The waiting was nerve-wracking. I took a seat on her luxurious couch and just sat there. My mind raced, going over possibilities and scenarios and making me a nervous wreck of anticipation. When the elevator finally came up to the penthouse, I felt a surge of excitement that my patience might finally pay off. She was framed in the elevator door as they opened, and it was the first time I'd ever met her in person. She wore a long tan coat and the same black boots she'd worn in her videos. Her shiny black hair was pulled back into its accustomed tail. As she stepped off the elevator, she let her coat puddle on the floor, and I could see her familiar black corset. She smiled when she saw me, and as I rose to greet her, she held out a finger, indicating me to stand and be quiet. She circled me, drinking me in with her eyes. The hungry way she looked at me made me both incredibly aroused and extremely uncomfortable. She was looking at me the way I look at a particularly tasty meal. Though this was certainly what I wanted, I had never seen someone look at another person that way before. She didn't say a word, just walked over to the camera and pointed it towards me. As she turned, I saw the red light was on. Looked like I was going to be in one of her movies tonight. "Don't worry," she said, her voice hinting at foreign places and exotic locales. "This is just for me. I'd never post anything online without your consent." I smiled at her and started to disrobe, but she stopped me with a delicate finger. "Leave them on. I like to handle the clothes myself." She stepped away from me then, eyes smoldering as she held me in her gaze, and then something happened. If you've ever seen one of those old werewolf movies, the kind where their whole body shifts in a rapid and sudden transformation, then you may have some idea of what I saw. If not, I'll try to explain it as best I can. Her body seemed to ripple, her whole form shuddering like an image in a pond, and suddenly there was something else in front of me. Her body was a long mass of jade scales towering 12 feet high. As it reached its full height, it had to crouch to avoid hitting the ceiling, but this seemed to suit it just fine. It crouched to eye level, its spade-shaped head hovering inches from my body, and I realized that its eyes, those vast and hovering pools of death, were the same as hers. I was trapped by those eyes, like a bird before the snake, and when she struck, I never even had a chance to run. If you're reading this, then your next question must be, how am I even writing this? Being eaten is normally where the story like this would end, but unfortunately for me, it's not. Lady Dragora, that queen serpent of myth, has been dining on humans for a very long time, it would seem. She neither bit nor tore me. Instead, she struck with a precision born of years of practice and swallowed me whole with little effort. As I slid down her throat, I felt the slimy walls caress me and the suffocating darkness inviting me towards terror. She had let me keep my phone, however, and as I wiggled to get it, I could feel a new sensation coursing through the giant muscles that were her body, the squirming desire for more. That's when I realized what she wanted. She doesn't want a quick meal. She doesn't want a satisfying feed. She wants a terrified body to thrash and scream as her body does what it does best. She wants my last few hours to be her pleasure. So I've been sitting as still as I can for the last hour of my life, writing this message to the outside world. I've sent a copy to my friends at the coffee shop, a copy to the Chicago police, and I've posted a copy here, hoping that someone will read this and take it seriously. I now know what happened to Justin's missing friend, what likely happened to Justin himself, and the fate that awaits me at the end of my life. I want my death to be the last, though, so if you read this and you see her, don't fall for her games. Don't let yourself be another meal for Lady Dragora.
Charles stepped into Funland Amusement and ground his teeth at the sight of children playing skee-ball and air hockey and the waka 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 of Pac-Man that filled the air. The great Gizmo, reduced to playing chess in a place like this. The owner started to say something to the well-dressed gentleman, but Charles waved him off. He didn't need directions. He and Gizmo were old friends, and he could practically smell the old gypsy from here. That was one of those words his great-great-grandchildren would have told him was a cancelable offense, but Charles didn't care. Much like the great Gizmo, Charles was from a different age. Charles had first met Gizmo in 1919, when the world was still new and things made sense. It had been at an expo in Coney Island, and his father had been rabid to see it. They say it's from Europe, and it's been touring since the 1800s. It's supposed to play chess like a grandmaster, Charlie boy, and they claim it's never been beaten. I want you to be the first one to do it, kiddo. Charlie's father had been a trainman, an engineer, and a grease monkey who had never gotten farther than the 5th grade. He had learned everything he knew at the side of better men, but he knew Charlie was special. Charles was 9 and already doing high school math, and not just reading Shakespeare, but understanding what he meant, doing numbers good enough to get a job at the broker's house if he wanted it. His father wouldn't hear of it, though. No genius son of his was going to run numbers for bingo boys, not when he could get an education and get away from this cesspool. Education, Charlie, that's what's going to lift you above the rest of us. Higher learning is what's going to get you a better life than your old man. One thing his dad did love, though, was chess. Most of the train guys knew the typical games: cards, dice, checkers, chess. But Charlie's dad had loved the game best of all. He was no grand master, barely above a novice, but he had taught Charles everything he knew about it from a very young age. Charles had absorbed it like a sponge. He was one of the best in the boroughs, maybe one of the best in the city, and he'd taken 3rd in the Central Park chess finals just last year. And that was against guys 3 times your age, kid, his dad had crowed. Now, he wanted his son to take on the great Gizmo. The exhibition was taking place in a big tent not far from the show hall, and it was standing room only. Lots of people wanted to see this machine that could beat a man at chess, and they all wanted a turn to try it out. Most of them wouldn't, Charlie knew, but they wanted the chance to watch it beat better men than them so they could feel superior for a little while. Charles didn't intend to give them the satisfaction. The man who'd introduced the thing was dressed in a crisp red and white striped suit, his flat-topped hat making him look like a carnival barker. He had thumped his cane and called the crowd to order, his eyes roving the men and women as if searching for the right victim. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I have here is the most amazing technical marvel of the last century. He has bested kings, geniuses, and politicians in the art of chess, and is looking for his next challenge. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the great Gizmo." Charles hadn't been terribly impressed when the man tore back the tarp to reveal the thing. It looked like a fortune teller, dressed in a long red robe with a turban on its head, boasting a tall feather and a large gem with many facets. It had a beard, a long mustachio that dripped with rings and bells, and a pair of far too expressive eyes. It moved jerkily, like something made of wires, and the people oohed and awed over it, impressed. "Now then, who will be the first to test its staggering strategy? Only $5 for the chance to best the great Gizmo." Charlie's father had started to step forward, but Charles put a hand on his arm. "Let's watch for a moment, Dad. I want to see how he plays." "You sure? I figured you'd stomp it first, and then we'd walk off with the glory." "I'm sure," Charles said, standing back to watch as the first fellow approached, paying his money and taking a seat. This was how Charles liked to play. First came the observation period, where he watched and made plans. He liked to stand back, blending in with the crowd so he could take the measure of his opponents. People rarely realized you were studying their moves, planning counter moves, and when you stepped up and trounced them, they never saw it coming. That was always his favorite part, watching their time-tested strategies fall apart as they played on and destroyed themselves by second-guessing their abilities. That hadn't happened that day in the tent at Coney Island. As much as he watched, and as much as he learned, Charles never quite understood the strategies at play with the great Gizmo. He stuck to no gambits, he initiated no set strategy, and he was neither aggressive nor careful. He answered their moves with the best counter move available every time, and he never failed to thwart them. After 5 others had been embarrassed, to the general amusement of the crowd, Charles decided it was his turn. "A kid?" the barker asked. "Mister, I'll take your money, but I hate to steal from a man." His father had puffed up at that. "Charlie's a chess prodigy. He'll whip your metal man." And so, Charles took his seat, setting eye to glass eye with the thing, and the game began. Charles would play a lot of chess in his lifetime, but he would never play a game quite that one-sided again. The great Gizmo thwarted him at every move, countered his counters, ran circles around him, and by the end, Charles wasn't sure he had put up any sort of fight at all. He had a middling collection of pieces, barely anything, and Gizmo had everything. "Checkmate," the thing had rasped, its voice full of secret humor, and Charles had nodded before walking away in defeat. "No sweat, Charlie boy," his father had assured him. "Damn creepy thing's a cheat anyway. That's what it is, just a cheatin' bit of nothing." Charles hadn't said anything, but he had made a vow to beat the pile of wires next time the chance arose. Charles saw the great Gizmo sitting in the back of the arcade, forgotten and unused. He didn't know how much the owner had paid for it, but he doubted it was making it back. The great gizmo was a relic. No one came to the arcade to play chess anymore. There was a little placard in front of him telling his history, and a sign that asked patrons not to damage the object. The camera overhead likely helped with that, but there was likely more to it than that. The great gizmo looked like something that shouldn't exist, something that flew in the face of this uncanny valley that his great-grandson talked about sometimes, and people found it off-putting. Charles, however, was used to it. "Do you remember me?" he asked, putting a quarter in as the thing shuddered and seemed to look up at him. Its robes were faded, its feather ragged, but its eyes were still intelligent. "Charles," it croaked, just as it had on that long-ago day. Charles had been in his second year of high school when he met the great gizmo for the second time. School was more of a formality than anything. He could pass any test that a college entrance board could throw at him, but they wouldn't give him the chance until he had a diploma. He was 16, a true prodigy now, and his chess skills had only increased over the years. He had taken Ruby Fawn to the fair that year, and that was where he saw the sign proclaiming the great gizmo would be in attendance. He had drugged her over to the tent, the girl saying that she didn't want to see that creepy old thing, but he wanted a second chance at it. His father was still working in the grease pits of the train yard, but he knew his face would light up when he heard how his son had bested his old chess rival. The stakes had increased in 7 years, it seemed. It was now $8 to play the champ, but the winner got a $50 cash prize. $50 was a lot of money in 1926, but Charles wanted the satisfaction of besting this thing more than anything. Despite what his father wanted, he had been running numbers for John McClure and his gang for over a year, and some well-placed bets had left him flush with cash. "Good luck, young man," said the barker, and Charles was surprised to find that it was the same barker as before. Time had not been kind to him. His suit was now faded, his hat frayed around the rim, and he'd put on weight which bulged around the middle and made the suit roll, spoiling the uniform direction of the stripes. Despite that, it was still him, and he grinned at Charles as he took his familiar seat. This time, the match was a little different. Charles had increased in skill, and he saw through many of the traps Gizmo set for him. The audience whispered quietly behind him, believing that the great Gizmo had met his match, but the real show was just beginning. Charles had taken several key pieces, and as he took a second rook, the thing's eyes sparkled, and it bent down as if to whisper something to him. The crowd would not have heard it. Its voice was too low, but the great Gizmo whispered a secret to Charles that would stick with him forever. "Charles, this will not be our last game. We will play 8 more times before the end." It was given in a tone of absolute certainty, not an offhanded statement made to get more of Charles's hard-earned money. Charles looked mystified, not sure if he had actually heard what the thing had said, and it caused him to flub his next move and lose a piece he had not wanted to. Charles persevered, however, pressing on and taking more pieces, and just as he believed that victory was within his grasp, the thing spoke again. "Charles, you will live far longer than you may wish to." Again, it was spoken in that tone of absolute assuredness, and it caused Charles to miss what would have been obvious. The great Gizmo won after 2 more moves, and Charles was again defeated. "Better luck next time," said the barker, and even Charles's date told him that he had done really well. Charles knew that he would never be great until he beat this machine, though. The pieces appeared. Charles set his up, and they began what would be their fourth game. Charles, strategically meeting the machine's offensive plays with his own practiced gambits, would gladly admit that the 3 games he had played against the great Gizmo had improved his chess game more than any other matches he had ever played. Charles had faced old-timers in the park, grand masters at chess tournaments, and everything in between. Despite it all, the great Gizmo never ceased to amaze and test his skill. Charles tried not to think of that last match. It was a match where Charles had done the one thing he promised he would never do. He had cheated. The great Gizmo had become something of a mania in him after he had lost to it a second time. He'd gone to college, married his sweetheart, and began a job that paid well and wasn't terribly difficult. With his business acumen, Charles had been placed as the manager of a textile mill. Soon, he had bought it and was running the mill himself. Charles had turned the profits completely around after he had purchased the mill, seeing what the owner was doing wrong and fixing it when the mill belonged to him. He'd come a long way from the little kid who sat in the tent at Coney Island, but that tent was never far from his mind. Charles had one obsession, and it was chess. Even his father had told him he took the game far too seriously. He and his father still played at least twice a week, and it was mostly a chance for the two to talk. His father was not able to work the train yard anymore. He lost a leg to one of the big locomotives when it had fallen out of the hoist onto him, but that hardly mattered. His father lived at the home that Charles shared with his wife, a huge mansion on the main street of town, and his days were spent at leisure now. "You're the best chess player I've ever met, Charlie, but you take it too seriously. It's just a game, an entertainment, but you treat every chess match like a war." Charles would laugh when he said these things, but his father was right. Every chess match was a war, and the general behind all those lesser generals was the great Gizmo. He had seen the old golem in various fairs and sideshows, but he had resisted the urge to go and play again. He couldn't beat him, not yet, and when he did play him, he wanted to be ready. He had studied chess the way some people study law or religion. He knew everything, at least everything that he could learn from books and experience, but it appeared he had one more teacher to take instruction from. Charles liked to go to the park and play against the old-timers that stayed there. Some of them had been playing chess longer than he'd been alive, and they had found ways to bend or even break the established rules of strategy. On the day in question, he was playing against a young black man. He called himself Kenny, and when he had taken Charles's rook, something strange happened. The rook was gone, but so had his knight that had been beside it. Charles knew the knight had been there, but when he looked across the board, he saw that it was sitting beside the rook on Kenny's side. He still won the match. Charles was at a point where he could win with nearly any 4 pieces on the board, but when they played again, he reached out and caught Kenny by the wrist as he went to take his castle off the board. In his hand was a pawn as well, and Kenny grinned like it was all a big joke. Charles wasn't mad, though. On the contrary. The move had been so quick, so smooth, that he hadn't even seen it the first time. He wondered if it would work for a creature that did not possess sight. It might be just the edge that he was looking for. "Hey, man, we ain't playing for money or nothing. There's no need to get upset over it." "Show me," Charles asked, and Kenny was more than happy to oblige. Kenny showed him the move, telling him the piece he palmed always had to be on the right of the piece that you would take. If it's on the left, they focus on that piece. If it's on the right, though, then the piece is practically hidden by the one you just put down. You can't hesitate. It's got to be a smooth move. But if you're quick enough, and you're sure enough, it's damn near undetectable. Charles practiced the move for hours, even using it against his own father, something he felt guilty about. He could do it without hesitation, without being noticed, and he was proud of his progress, despite the trickery. He was practicing it for 2 years before he got the chance to take on the great Gizmo again. By then, Charles was a master of not just chess, but of that little sleight of hand. He hadn't dared use it at any of the chess tournaments. The refs were just too vigilant, as were the players. But in casual games, as well as at the park, he had become undetectable by any but the most observant. He was good enough to do it without hesitation, and when he opened his paper and saw a squib that the great Gizmo would be at Coney Island that weekend, right before going overseas for a 10-year tour, he knew this would be his chance. There was no fee to play against it this time. The barker was still there, but he looked a little less jolly these days. He was an old, fat man who had grown sour and less jovial. He looked interested in being gone from here, in getting to where he would be paid more for the show. He told Charles to take a spot in line, and as the players took their turns, many of them people Charles had bested already, they were quickly turned away with a defeat at the hands of the golem. The great Gizmo looked downright dapper as he sat there, seeing that the man had gotten him a new robe and a feather for his journey. The eyes still sparkled knowingly, however, and Charles settled himself so as not to be thrown by any declaration of future knowledge this time. The pieces came out, and the game began. Charles did well at first. He was cutting a path through the great Gizmo's defenses, and the thing again told him they would play 8 more times before the end. That was a constant, it seemed, but after that, the match turned ugly. The great Gizmo recaptured some of his pieces and set them to burning. Charles was hurting, but still doing well. He took a few more, received his next expected bit of prophecy, and then the play became barbaric. The great Gizmo was playing very aggressively, and Charles had to maneuver himself to stay 1 step ahead of the thing. He became desperate, trying to get the old golem into position, and when he saw the move, he took it. He had palmed a knight and a pawn when something unexpected happened. The great Gizmo grabbed his hand, just as he had grabbed Kenny's, and it leaned down until its eyes were inches from his. It breathed out, its breath full of terrible smoke and awful prophecy, and Charles began to choke. The smoke filled his mouth, taking his breath, and he blacked out as he fell sideways. The thing let go of him as he fell, but his last image of the great Gizmo was of its 2 expressive eyes watching him with disappointment. He'd been found wanting again, and Charles wondered before passing out if there would be a 4th time. Charles woke up 3 days later in the hospital, his wife rejoicing that God had brought him back to them. By then, the great Gizmo was on a boat to England, out of his reach. The year after that, World War II would erupt, and Charles had feared that he would never get another match with this creature. The match began as it always did. Charles put aside the great Gizmo's gambits, one at a time. He played brilliantly, thwarting the golem's best defenses, and then it came time to attack. He cut the great Gizmo to shreds, his line all a tatter, and when he told him that they would play 8 games before the end, Charles knew he was advancing well. He had lost barely any pieces of his own, and as the thing began to set its later plans in order, he almost laughed. This was proving to be too easy. The great gizmo and the Barker had been in Poland when it fell to the Blitzkrieg, and the great gizmo had dropped off the face of the earth for a while. Charles had actually enlisted after Pearl Harbor, but not for any sense of patriotism. He had a mania growing in him, and it had been growing for years. He knew where the thing had last been, and he meant that he would find the Barker and his mysterious machine. The Army was glad to have him, and his time in college made it easy to become an officer after basic training. They offered him a desk job, something in shipping, but he turned them down. If he wanted to find the great gizmo, he would have to go to war. He had fought at Normandy and Paris and 100 other skirmishes, and that was where he discovered something astounding. Despite the danger that Charles put himself in, he didn't die. Charles was never more than slightly wounded, a scratch or a bruise, but sustained no lasting damage. He wondered how this could be, but then he remembered the words of the great gizmo. "You will live far longer than you may wish to." He returned home after the war, but the old construct never returned to America. It took a while for his contacts to get back on their feet, but eventually what he got were rumors and hearsay. He heard that Hitler had taken the thing, adding it to his collection of objects he believed to be supernatural. He heard it had been destroyed in a bombing run over Paris. He heard one of MacArthur's generals had taken it as the spoil of war, and many other unbelievable things. After the war, it was supposed to have been taken to Jordan, then to Egypt, to Russia, to South Africa, and finally back to Europe. But he never could substantiate these things. And all the while, Charles grew older, less sturdy, but he never died. He was over 100 years old now, 106 to be precise, but he could pass for a robust 50 most of the time. He had buried his wife, all 3 of his children, 2 of his grandchildren as well. He'd lost his youngest son to Vietnam and his oldest grandson to the Iraq War. He was trying to keep his great-grandson from enlisting. They all seemed to want to follow in his footsteps, but they couldn't grasp that he had not done this for his country. "Checkmate," he spat viciously as he conquered his old rival. He had gone to war not for his wife or the baby in her arms, or even for the one holding her hand. He had gone to war for this metal monstrosity and the evil prophecy that it held. "Well played," it intoned, and he hated the sense of pride that filled him at those words. "You may ask one question, any question, and I will answer it for you. You have defeated the great gizmo, and now the secrets of the universe are open to you." Some men would have taken this chance to learn the nature of time, the identity of God, maybe even the night's lotto numbers, but there was only one question that interested Charles. "How much longer will I live?" The great gizmo sat back a little, seeming to contemplate the question. "You will live for as long as there is a great gizmo. Our lives are connected by fate, and we shall exist together until we do not." Charles thought about that for a long time, though he supposed he had known all along what the answer would be. The man behind the counter looked startled when the old man approached him and asked to buy the great gizmo. "That old thing?" he asked, not quite believing it. "It's an antique, buddy. I picked it up in Maine, hoping it would draw in some extra customers, but it never did. Thing creeps people out." "It creeps me out, too, if I'm being honest. I guess I'd sell it to you for $1,500. That's what I paid for it, and I'd like to get at least what I paid back for the damn thing." Charles brought out a money clip and peeled $200 bills. from it. He handed them to the man, saying he would have men here to collect it within the hour. Hey, pal, you paid me too much. I only wanted... The rest is a bonus for finding something I've searched for my whole life. He called the men he had hired to move the thing, and stayed there until they had it secured on the truck. Charles had a spot at the house for it, a room of other treasures that he had found while looking for the old golem. The walls were fire retardant, the floor was concrete, the ceiling was perfectly set to never fall or shift. Charles had been keeping a spot for the great Gizmo for years, and now he would keep him and himself for as long as forever would last. Or at least, he reflected, for 4 more chess matches. Wasn't that what the great Gizmo had promised him, after all?